Hey everybody, welcome to Dad's Den of Pop Culture. Today, I want to talk about a story, novel, published eventually in 1952 as The Space Merchants, but first appearing in Galaxy Science Fiction as a three-part story over 3 issues called Gravy Planet. Written by Frederick Pohl and Cyril M. Kornbluth, it is a dystopian tale of a world dominated, governed by transnational companies and by advertising agencies. And it's really a rather interesting piece of work. So how did I come across this thing? I am a big fan of old time radio, especially because I have a job in which I do a lot of data collection, data analysis, a lot of numbers. Sometimes it helps to have something interesting going on to keep that sort of creative side of the brain, going while the analytical side gets things done. And, some people would use books on tape. I use old time radio shows sometimes, and podcasts, things like that. And so I happened onto one that was a collection of sci-fi, and in particular Gravy Planet, and I was really struck by it. So I said, well, let's see if I can actually find the story. I want to read the actual story because, an adaptation is going to leave things out, maybe change things. Although I will say the adaptation, it did leave some things out. It was pretty true to the story, though, so they did a fairly good job. But I went out and I found it in the June 1952 Galaxy Science Fiction Part 1. The others were there too. Found it on the Internet Archive. Read over it, and I really liked it. So I thought, well, it'd be a good thing to talk about on the channel. So, how does this story begin? It begins just like that, with that picture. Gravy Planet, like I said, is a dystopian tale of the future. You don't know exactly how far in the future. Pretty far. Pretty far in the future. But they still have a remembrance of the past. The classic advertising campaigns of the 1940s and 50s are now enshrined in art museums. Because, who cares about art when you can have that? In the story, we really begin with a character named Mitch Courtney. Now, Mitch Courtney is a star-class copywriter for the Fowler Schocken ad agency. And this is the big ad agency and the best ad agency. Now, how do you know it's the biggest and the best? Because they have, are you ready for this? They have a conference room, measures 10 foot by 10 foot. It's huge. And this clues you in early on to the kind of dystopia we're looking at. It is an overpopulated Earth, and it is an Earth that is running out of natural resources. But the folks in charge, their entire system is based upon consumption, consumption, consumption. They can't slow it down. They can't stop it. They don't really want to. It is looked at by them as an absolute good. And so that's what they push. And over the course of the story, you get to see all sorts of this, of what this has led to, the kind of future it has created. And these were hot button issues at the time, without a doubt. So Mitch Courtney has a wife, although she hasn't registered as his wife yet. They're living separately. He loves her, but, she's a little bit cold on the whole ad business and what he does. She thinks he could be much more. She's a medical doctor. And so as we begin the story, it's him getting up, doing his morning routine, lathering this stuff on to take off his beard rather than using razors. He runs to work. He gets there a little bit late because he's stopped to talk to his wife. He has to sort of stop into her clinic and trick her into seeing him. They have a brief conversation. Doesn't go great, but he does manage to get a date with her for the night, so he's pretty happy about that. Gets into work, and he gets into a meeting in the conference room that I talked about with Fowler Schocken, who's kind of giving everybody the pep talk, and this is the clip that I that I will read because it kind of gives you an idea of the world in which they're living, even from the standpoint of somebody who's up towards the top of his world. This is the world that he knows and that he's very satisfied with. So, Fowler Shotgun says, and I will say this, the actor in that radio adaptation, perfect voice for the character. If you've watched any old TV from the, or movies from the 40s and 50s, you know the type. This sort of deep-voiced boss he's the booster, he's the pep guy. So Fowler Shotgun says, "We have a nice conference room here, men, as we should have. Fowler Shotgun Associates is the largest advertising agency in the city. We bill a megabuck a year more than anybody else around. And," he looked around at all of us, "I think you'll agree that all find it worthwhile. I don't believe there's a person in this room who has less than a 2-room apartment." He twinkled at me. "Even the bachelors. Speaking for myself, I've done well. My summer place looks right over one of the largest parks on Long Island. I haven't tasted any protein but new meat for years, and when I go out for a spin, I pedal a Cadillac. The wolf is a long way from my door, and I think any one of you can say the same, right?" And after this speech, he says, "But I think we can do more." And this introduces a major part of this story, which is, and you can see it in this image here, the Venus rocket. And so, on the Earth at this time, they have sent a man to Venus to survey it. And the next step is terraforming. And Fowler Shotgun wants to be in on the ground floor because they have an opportunity to completely dominate the development of Venus, a whole planet that can be made in their image, which is obviously an image that has not done too well for old planet Earth. And so he decides that Mitch Courtney is the man to head this project. He needs to get out there. He needs to convince consumers, that's what they call folks, consumers. Consumers need to sign up. You need to convince them that Venus is a absolute paradise. Beautiful. And we need 3,000 hardy souls to pile on that rocket. I think it was 3,000 anyways. To pile on this rocket and go to Venus and make a whole new world for Fowler Shotgun to exploit. And Courtney jumps right in. This is a big deal. It means the old man really thinks highly of him to give him this assignment. And so he starts working with everybody and getting things going. And he decides he needs to talk to the man who visited Venus. Now, in the meantime, has a dinner with his wife, with Kathy. And there's a disturbance. A young man enters, a member of a terrorist organization, the World Conservation Association, a CONSI. All right-thinking people hate the CONSIs. They want to, well, just disrupt everything. They want to end this beautiful utopian society that they've built of consumerism. Nobody likes the CONSIs, and he is dealt with rather severely, and it's very upsetting, but they move on with their lives. And they ultimately meet the fella that went to Venus, Jack O'Shea. Now, Jack O'Shea is a little person. The Venus probe, they needed to conserve as much space as possible. And so, smaller person, lower weight, uses less water, uses less food. And he was essentially entombed in this rocket, which lands on Venus, and he is able to look at the surface of Venus, not get out or anything like that. I will say, this is science fiction at the point where they knew that Venus, in fact, was a hellscape. So it's not like the older, space operas where Venus is like this jungle world with dinosaurs. This is the real Venus. And he comes back, and he's a hero. Women love him, and he's, living it up. But he's got a deep melancholy to him as well. And he agrees to help Mitch essentially lie to the public about Venus, which he's sort of been doing all along. Because he tells Mitch, under no illusions here. Venus is a hellscape. I mean, anybody who's going to try to colonize and terraform it is going to have to live inside bunkers for who knows how long before they can even get started. Now, of course, the science boys, they have ideas on how we're going to do this and how we're going to do that. Okay, but you get the idea. And Jack becomes a friend of Mitch. And Jack might have a thing for Kathy, who seems rather taken with the little astronaut. And that kind of becomes an issue for Mitch as the story goes on. So, in the course of Mitch and Jack going here and going there, there are a couple assassination attempts on Mitch. Now, this is a big deal because the penalty for murder in this world is pretty severe. It is essentially, if I remember correctly, an injection that puts a person through about like 100 years of agonizing pain in a very brief period of time, and either kills them or leaves them completely mentally shattered. And especially if you're attacking a star class copywriter, that's a big deal. No sane person would do such a thing. And yet it does seem as though somebody has him targeted. And who could it be? Who could it be? Is it the consies? He thinks it's probably the conservationists. They're against this whole Venus thing. They don't want to see this happen. But maybe it's a rival of Fowler Shockin. Could be. And so in the course of Mitch Courtney trying to get Kathy to love him again, they go on this trip to see the Venus rocket. And at one point, they stop in San Diego to visit the Fowler Shockin office there because there's some things going wrong. And Courtney finds that it's not being run properly. And they great description of these buildings in California that are essentially like scaffoldings with like covered by, I think it was plastic or cloth or something. Because of all the earthquakes, these things, they shake a little bit more, but they don't fall down as easily. And if they do fall down, they're easier to rebuild. Don't use as many resources, which is a big problem. Maybe we can assume in the future a lot of old California has been shaken to the ground, and they just can't afford to rebuild it. And so he goes to find the fella in charge, and that takes him up to, or I'm trying to think now, is it to the Arctic or Antarctic? I think the Antarctic. Takes a rocket jet to the Antarctic because he's going to find this guy and he's going to straighten him out. And in the process, another assassination attempt. And he is knocked unconscious out on the snows. And there's some really great sci-fi writing through this of him getting equipped for the journey and the rocket jet ride and the descriptions. The story is in some ways a sort of a picaresque of this dystopian world. They do some fairly good world building. And I think any sci-fi fan, especially of, dystopian sci-fi, would probably enjoy seeing this world where everything is taken to this sort of, outlandish conclusion. So now I'm going to put up the spoiler sign because I want to cover this whole story. I don't want to just leave it there because it's worth. I think the ending is worth talking about. So we go to the next issue of Galaxy Science Fiction, July 1952, and you'll notice the cover has nothing to do with this particular story. Oh, you know what? Let me go back, though, a little bit to that first cover, because the first cover does have something to do with the story. You see this contraption here, this taxi that's being pedaled. Yeah, the cars in this world are generally pedaled. They're like rickshaws because they can't afford the fuel. And water is really tight, and everything's really tight on this world. Now, the cityscape in the background doesn't look like the cityscapes that are described. That looks far too futuristic and and nice to be the New York that's being described in this tale. So we go to the next one. So Mitch Courtney now has been knocked out, and he wakens to find himself on a rocket jet transport, sort of stowed away with all the other, consumers, the little people. And he finds that his ID number on his arm has been altered. His is here, but it's been made longer. It's his social security number. That's what's used to identify people. And your rank in society. He had a low number. Now it's a very high number, which places him in the lower echelons of society. And this is where Mitch Courtney starts to see the underbelly of what he believes is the utopia in which he lives. For he is taken down to South America to a processing center where meat is produced. And the way they do this, and some of the descriptions therein, are, to me, it's horrific. It really creeps me out. If this was ever put on screen, I think it would bother people deeply. It's almost like body horror. It's not, but I don't know, it feels like it's running parallel to body horror. But you also see how the lower classes live. They're served addictive products, which Mitch Courtney is completely aware of. Hey, that's good for business. Get them addicted, at an early age to these things. They're fed addictive products, but they have to pay for phone calls. They have to pay to use the bathroom. They have to pay to do everything. Everything is on a cash basis. And it's set up so that the salary you're being paid pretty much always keeps you in debt. You can never buy yourself up. You're always trying to just keep barely ahead, if ahead at all. And it really doesn't change his opinion of the utopia exactly. But he's starting to sour on it a little bit. But he's still got that patriotism for Fowler Shockin and for the way things are done. And he still kind of loves it. So this food processing place, you got this giant tower with all these sort of windows that open up, and it's surrounded by these solar panels to focus the heat of the sun into this place. And on all these upper levels, I'm pointing to the screen that you can't see. I mean, you can, but anyways, you can't see my finger on it, so it doesn't matter. But on all these upper levels, there are these vats where they grow, kind of like an algae, kind of like a feed. And he has to take the job of being one of the skimmers. They skim this gunk off the top of the vat, and they put it into these things that send it down into the basement to what is referred to as Chicken Little. So Chicken Little is chicken meat. It's been grown from like chicken DNA. It's not a chicken. It's just the meat. A giant quivering mass of chicken meat with pipes feeding this solution into it. They slow it down at night for the growth. But other than that, it's always growing. And so a higher level of employee trims meat off of the edges. And that meat is then processed and eaten by people. And they cut it right off, the living thing. And there's Mitch doing the skimming. So let's move ahead. So there's an image that they have of this giant mass of flesh. And they said if, they weren't trimming it, it would conceivably grow to cover who knows how much, the whole world maybe. And there are probably other operations like this too. And so while Mitch Courtney is working in these conditions, under a different name, because they've given him this different identity, he comes across some consies. The consies have a cell here. And he decides, okay, now I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'll infiltrate their cell. And then I'll have my revenge, and I'll get back to where I'm supposed to be in society. And so this is another creepy scene. The head of the cell, they have their headquarters underneath Chicken Little. And so he has this sort of device that makes this almost unhearable sound that causes the flesh mound to move away from it. And so he essentially, you can kind of see this in this image, he kind of creates this bubble within this flesh mound that he and Mitch can walk through. And when they get to the center, they pull up a grating and they go down into this little headquarters. And that way nobody can find it, because nobody else knows this secret. And so here Mitch is inducted into the World Conservation Association and becomes, they think, a consi. And he even now starts trying to up their game, because he's a copywriter. That's what he does. He goes, oh, this literature is no good. You got to really hammer home. You got to make it simple. So he sort of becomes kind of a bit of a big wheel, because he's improving the way the consis are getting their message out to people. And of course, it's all a bunch of nonsense, even though he's reading it and he's understanding it. But maybe there's a kernel of understanding in Mitch at this point. He's not seeing it their way, but at least he's more aware of what they're saying, of their tales of what Earth used to be like before unbridled consumption brought it to where it is. And so he gets in sort of big with the folks, and they decide to send him back to New York to do some work for them there. So off he goes, and he immediately makes contact with his former secretary, who is loyal to him, and gets into the building, Fowler-Schocken building. And there's a great scene where he visits upper level and sees people playing golf. But of course, there's no room for golf courses in this world. And so it's like this miniature little golf course, and people control. If this was done at a later time, it would be a video game. But they didn't have video games yet, and they weren't thinking about them. So it's this sort of miniature version of golf. Just a nice little detail of the world. And so he ends up making contact with his secretary and manages to get put on a rocket to the moon, because he's chasing down these leads. And so he gets up to the moon, and here he has a big revelation. His secretary is killed on the way there. He thinks it's meant for him. And here he manages to get in contact with the WCA, and he discovers that his wife, Kathy, is a high-ranking member. And they were trying to get him on their side to see what was going on, because they have a grander scheme in mind. And he wants nothing to do with it. And he manages to hook back up with Fowler-Schocken, who, puts him under protective guard, and we're going to get you back, and blah, 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 blah. And there's some really interesting stuff that happens at this point. I'm not going to go into all of it, but one of the things he discovers ultimately is that, first of all, his secretary wasn't assassinated. She killed herself because she was in love with him, and he clearly wasn't returning that love. That was pretty heartbreaking. But he also discovers that their rivals are in fact trying to kill him, and they are using psychopaths to do it, which is something that I guess in this world they just don't take account of. How could somebody want to do something that would lead to terrible punishment? And there's a really creepy, scary scene where he has been captured and is essentially being tortured by one of these psychopaths. I'm telling you, this is a book that goes places you really didn't expect. It's not just a dystopian the Earth's too crowded and there's no, we're running out. But gets into some pretty horrific stuff. I think it would actually make a pretty good movie. I might be hard to film, but some wiser people than me might put this together. So we hit part 3 of Gravy Planet. I'm going to keep this relatively short because I've already been chatting for a while here, and I don't want to make this too super long. But in part 3, we get some interesting stuff. He's back on board Fowler Shocking, and he's going to make this thing happen, and get this everything back on the right path. But he is definitely at this point becoming more sympathetic to the Consies. And he is now secretly helping them. What they want to do is load this rocket up with Consies and go to Venus and terraform it and make a new world. Because they know there's no going back on Earth. It can't be saved. It can't be improved. The people don't even want it to. They're hopelessly addicted. They're not going to change the world. Let's start over again. And probably the best set piece in this part of the story is a visit to Congress. Now, are you ready for some absolutely outlandish science fiction stuff? Things that are impossible. The members of Congress do not represent the states or the voters anymore. They represent corporations. I know. Utter fantasy. But you literally have, at least they're honest about it, you literally have will the senator from Coca-Cola please stand and give his address to the... And so there's a big deal in Congress. Everything's kind of falling apart. They're becoming suspicious. And, the fix is in maybe. They know that he's been maybe working with the Consies, or at least there's, there's talk of this. And the president, who he has met and thinks is just like this little meek guy, turns out to be the president of the United States. It's hereditary and kind of a figurehead. But he does have one power. And that is to, close Congress. He can close a session of Congress. And he does, and there's a giant uproar, and the president sort of helps him escape into this, waiting limo. And he now thinks that he's been betrayed by the Consies once again, Mitch. And he's ready to go ballistic over it. But he finally makes it to the rocket. With just a moment to spare. He gets through the corporate security. And off he launches. His wife is there, straps him in. And the two fully reconcile. He is on their side, and he's all for it, and let's go escape to Venus. Now, the radio show essentially ends it there. It's a bit of a happy ending. The story goes further. And I think this is where it actually becomes interesting and not simply just a tale of consumerism gone mad. They land, and it's an interesting situation for Mitch Courtney because he's a star-class copyrightist, and there's no need for that on this new world. They need technicians, engineers, and scientists. They need people who can do hard labor because to go out onto the surface of Venus, like I said, is a hellscape. They have a way to do it, to start setting things up, to try to start the terraforming process and make a place where they can live. But it's rugged work. And Mitch is essentially useless, and he's becoming pretty bummed out because Kathy is not useless, and she's very busy. And he feels just like, tossed aside. He was absolutely vital to getting them to this world, and they all appreciate and respect him for that. But now that they're there, he's useless. And he decides to go out on one of these missions and actually help do something. He says, heck, at least I can do some physical labor. Well, he's not really built for physical labor. And he lies to them that he knows what he's doing. So they get out there, and these winds are unbelievable across the surface of Venus. And he ends up having an accident. And I believe his suit is slightly... No, it isn't pierced. But he ends up hitting this rock, which he sees literally melting away in the wind before his very eyes. And he gets dragged back into the rocket. And so he got some of this rock soil on the suit and clearly makes contact with it as he's getting out of the rig and being taken to medical care. And he's now made a discovery, which at first he doesn't understand. There is a sentient microbial life on Venus. And he's become sort of infected by it. They're communicating with him, although he doesn't really understand this. He thinks that as a result of everything, he's becoming suicidal because he has this compulsion to just walk out of this rocket onto the surface without a suit. Well, that's these microbes who want to get out and get back into their native environment because they can't survive outside of it. And he manages to put it together, and he gets it on a slide, and maybe it was his blood, I can't remember now, but he discovers the native Venusians. And he shows it to Kathy, and they figure out how they work. They work off of radiation. That's how they survive. And in turn, they produce, I think they produce oxygen as a byproduct. So they go, hey, this is perfect. So they use because this is an atomic rocket. They use that to feed these little entities, and they start terraforming Venus. And they're all very proud of themselves. We're going to turn this into a garden planet so much more quickly than we thought we would. Almost overnight are we going to be able to do this now. And as the story ends, the sort of question is asked, well, what about the natives? And they don't really care. Well, I guess some of them will survive. But they know they're sentient beings. And so the World Conservation Association, who seem to be the good guys, turn out to be just as shitty as the multinational corporations. Really. They're really just in it for themselves. They don't give a damn who gets hurt in the process. Kind of a downer ending, but I think a very important statement about humanity. And we have that in us, don't we? Sometimes even when we think we're doing right, we're maybe not quite doing right. But we have that, instinct to survive. But sadly also an instinct to use others to get what we want. And as you grow older and you see that in action, maybe read science fiction novels that kind of touch on that, you get a much better appreciation of those religions and philosophies that have really attempted to rebel against that instinct, to say that no, everyone is important, equally important. Maybe not measured materially, maybe not measured in terms of how much they can earn, what they can produce, but on a spiritual level, we're all equally important. And people are not to be used. People are not a means to your end. They are an end in and of themselves. But the Consies, hey, we got a new planet. Too bad for the Venusians. They're out. And so ends Gravy Planet, with Mitch Courtney looking on into the distance. I know I didn't use all these images, but there we get to the beginning. So I have not read the novelized version called The Space Merchants, but it has generally been recognized as one of the greater science fiction novels of all time, and especially in terms of the dystopian science fiction. It's been looked at as, akin to a Brave New World. Not really like 1984. It's a little more sci-fi than that, but I was really impressed. It's very well written, and I've outlined the story for you here, but you really need to read it yourself to get all these little details of this world. If you're a role-playing game guy, you could get some good ideas out of this. You could even maybe turn this into, a world you could use with some sci-fi modern type rules. Got a lot of very clever ideas, inside, and what life might be like on a truly overcrowded world. There's a scene in a stairwell that needs to be read. It's really fantastic stuff. So I found these copies on the Internet Archive, Galaxy Science Fiction, because finding these out there might be difficult to find copies and pay for them. But you can certainly find the the Space Merchants out there. They're it's affordable. Now, I don't know if they made changes. There might have been changes made to the story here and there when they had it published as a novel. That happens sometimes. So it could differ in some ways, but the version I read, very impressed. And I think you should give it a try. Published 1952, Frederick Pohl and Cyril M. Kornbluth. Frederick Pohl did do a sequel in 70s or 80s. I really don't know anything about it, but Gravy Planet / The Space Merchants, definitely worth your time if you are into sci-fi, if you're into dystopian novels, and maybe even if you're just into sort of the human condition. And if you've read it, I'd love to hear what you think about this work. I think it should definitely be more read than it is, and I think it'd make a great basis for a sci-fi movie. Live action or animated, but live action, that Chicken Little, oh, dude, it still gives me the creeps thinking about it. It just, I don't know, maybe it hits a certain thing for me that just like gets to the core of me, but like, oh, just this giant quivering mountain of, anyways. But if you've read it, hey, and you want to leave some thoughts, I'd love to hear them. Love to chat with everybody about this book in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. That's very helpful to the channel. Maybe you want to subscribe. I touch on all sorts of pop culture, not just books, also comic books, also toys, TV, movies, the whole 9 yards of 20th century and I guess now 21st century American pop culture. I'd love to have you as a subscriber, or, well, I guess follower technically. I guess it's not a subscription. I don't have a pay subscription thing going at this point. But if you'd like to follow the channel, whatever the term is, please do so. And maybe share with your friends. And in the meantime, God bless everyone. God bless us all for not living in this world yet. Be kind to one another and try to have some fun out there. And I will see you next time around in Dad's Den of Pop Culture.